Hey everyone, Ryan Ripley here. Before we get started today, I wanted to tell you about one of my favorite Agile conferences, The Path to Agility. It's May 25th and 26th in Columbus, Ohio, at the Ohio Union, that is on the campus of Ohio State University. Here to help us learn more about this great event is Conference Chair Faye Thompson. Hey, Faye.
Hey, Ryan. We're really excited about the path this year. We have Ellen Gottesdiener, Gil Broza, and Jason Womack as some of our keynotes. We also are featuring Johanna Rothman, Michael Ma, Christopher Avery in our speaker lineup. We have a new feature this year. We're offering 4 maker spaces where people can learn about new technologies in a hands-on way. It's really rounding out to be a great event. Tickets are still on sale. And if you're interested, you can register at www.thepathtoagility.com.
Yeah, the Central Ohio Agile Association, or COHA, as many of us know them, they organized this event. They put it together wonderfully. It's at a beautiful venue. And unlike a lot of other Agile conferences, the tracks cover the entire spectrum of Agile software development, from leadership to craftsmanship. And I'll even be there as a speaker and also podcasting throughout the event. Please be sure to stop by and say hello. This really is one of the great Agile conferences of the year, and we all hope to see you there next week.
Processes and tools dominate today's Agile discussions, but we are devoted to the individuals and interactions that make it work. From the beginner to the veteran practitioner, we have something for you. Welcome to Agile for Humans.
All right, welcome to this week's episode of Agile for Humans. I'm your host, Ryan Ripley. Joining me today, Troy Magennis has agreed to come on the show and talk about his accepted talk, Data-Driven Coaching, Safely Turning Team Data into Coaching Insights. And so, Troy, welcome to the show. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, definitely. With such an interesting topic, really couldn't resist at least asking to see if you'd come on and join us. It seems like a wonderful combination of promoting safety on a team, looking at real data, and then generating some coaching insights that will help make everyone's lives and work better. So seemed very congruent with what some of our past episodes and some of the things that we hold dear on this podcast. So really appreciate you jumping on the show and sharing at least some bits of the talk. We won't ask you to give away the punchline, of course, but really appreciate you joining us to talk about these really interesting topics.
No, it's great to be here. I love talking about metrics, so bring it on.
So with this particular talk, you're certainly looking for coaching insights, and that was what initially caught my attention. So when you're thinking about driving towards finding these insights, what are the metrics that you find most valuable? How do you go about collecting those?
That's a great question. Now, the main basis of what I find about using metrics is you can't use just one. What you're trying to get the teams to do is trade something they're doing really well at for something they're doing poorer at, and understand that they're making these intelligent trade-offs. So what we tend to do is show a matrix of metrics, normally just 4. We want a measure of responsiveness, how fast the team can respond to we need something, a productivity metric about how they're actually delivering and is the pace increasing or decreasing over time, a measure of quality, which is something you're often always trading against with productivity, and a measure of predictability. How well can I assume that your current productivity is going to continue in the future? So what we tend to like to do is always show at least 1 or 2 metrics from each of those categories. And if you do that, then what you're helping the team do is understand that, well, given that we're way above the company average on productivity, but we're trending poorly on quality, let's spend a sprint or 2 understanding how we can improve our quality, even if it does impact our productivity. And so it's about balance. It's about creating those wise trades.
So it seems like over a longer period of time, so let's say you're doing this sprint over sprint for a while, the insights you're generating are really where the boundaries are. Is that fair?
Yeah, that's right. And it's more about the trend than the individual measure. So if you have a poor sprint or week, as long as the team can reflect on, we understand why that occurred, and that's unlikely to happen in the future, versus we understand why it occurred, and unless we do something proactive to fix that, it's going to continue to degrade. That's the type of insight we're trying to help the team make. And then we're helping them make a measured adjustment so that they don't decimate one of the other categories of important metric.
Do you have an example of working with a team where you had to address that kind of trade-off? And perhaps can you go into some of the responses of the team and how they felt about giving up a strength to perhaps improve a weakness and how some of those dynamics play out?
Well, I mean, we're taught from a very young age that we need to be really good at everything. The whole of our schooling system is about trying your hardest. It's not about just doing enough to get by. It's about excelling at what you do. I get that sort of quote from Michael Tardif, a coach here in Seattle. So it's very difficult to get people to give up something they're really good at. They tend to see something they're being better than the rest of the company on and want to decimate the company even more. They want to keep moving forward on productivity, which the measure I tend to settle on is the throughput divided by the team size. So it was throughput normalized by how big your team is. So that's a very hard one to get people to trade. But what you'll see if you overdrive how fast you're trying to get things through a system, you'll start seeing that your predictability gets wild. So one sprint you get maybe 10 stories finished, and the next sprint you get maybe 1 finished, and the next sprint you get maybe 11 finished. You start seeing these oscillations. So often it's about, well, what if you only chose to do 5 things next sprint and make sure that we can continue to do 5 or 6 every sprint, so balance out that average. So that's normally the starting point, is to get people to stop trying to overdrive their system and leave some slack so that they can improve the predictability. That's a selfish one for me, because once they get predictable on any of those, especially on the throughput measure, forecasting becomes a lot easier to do.
Yeah, it's amazing how a little bit of slack makes for a little more predictability. It's counterintuitive, but it seems to work out almost every time.
That's right. So from the Kanban and the Scrum side, we start sort of, on the Kanban side, we would sort of saying, why don't we start introducing some WIP limits on what we want to do concurrently at the same time? And on the Scrum side, we might say, we're doing a forecast of what we can do here. Let's fill what we think we can do and then take one risky thing off. And once we achieve that, let's leave the risky thing for the first thing we do in the next sprint. So it's helping the team realize that they're trading some productivity short term for predictability long term. And over 5 or 6 sprints, it's going to be exactly the same. But now we've got 2 stable measures, not one randomly oscillating measure.
If the client would rather have predictability over that productivity, then it's a good trade to make. But context is always important, right? If they want the productivity instead, then I guess you shift away from the predictable model. Or is that?
No, that's exactly right. I mean, what we're helping and coaching the teams in understanding is the business. And if you've just done a release, or say you're running a healthcare marketplace website for the government, when it goes live, you know that productivity doesn't matter so much at the moment. You need to have a lot of people perhaps sitting idle, waiting for critical issues so that they can be resolved. And when we do that with rescue services and fire services all the time, we're okay having a lot of slack in place for much higher response time, much lower response time, getting people. We don't want to wait to get someone out of a burning house. So we pay a price by having firemen sit essentially idle. They've got other jobs to do, but they're jobs they will trade away to go and do something more important. So we want to help the teams understand the context of the business. And you're right. Sometimes sometimes response time trumps productivity and predictability, because we just need to get it done to solve a fire, to solve an emergency in our software terms, which might be an outage during a long weekend sales event or something like that.
Well, and I think it's an interesting insight, because I think a lot of people look at the metrics and collecting metrics as a way to measure and manage a team, as opposed to ensure alignment with business value. And I think it's important to point that out, that the metrics that teams collect and that product owners collect can also help with that alignment factor. And it's not necessarily you weren't productive enough. It's no, we value X factor, and we want to make sure we're pushing to that. And I think that gets lost in some of these conversations sometimes.
Yeah, we were exactly productive enough to deliver the predictability and responsiveness you needed to keep the business running is a much different statement than just go faster. When you say just go faster, there's everyone leaves off the second sentence. If we do that, X will suffer. And is X more important than going faster? And at different times of the business, it is.
That along with context. And so I think those are two important factors to take place or to take into account when looking at the overall metrics discussion. I think in our industry, and Troy, tell me if I'm wrong, there are camps that would say all metrics are evil, they lead to bad things, they aren't agile. But I think in some cases used in a way that where the goal is to enhance safety, facilitate transparency, and to increase trust, they can be a good thing.
Yeah, I mean, you're always on dangerous territory when you use the word no, always. There's always there's a continuum of in every measure and aspect to everything in Agile, and so of course you could misuse metrics, and of course people have and always and will continue to misuse metrics,
Right.
But what's the alternative? We want to then make sure that we don't not use metrics just because all metrics are evil, but then don't look at where we could build a case to represent and communicate that we need something to do something. Yeah, I mean, if you are just measuring a single metric or it's invasive, classic ones might be that I've seen is where in the lunchrooms, in the meal areas, was a screen listing the developers and the number of defects they had open.
Oof.
And now, of course, that does have a short-term win. It appears as if the defects start being completed, and they probably are. But you end up developing this back channel. You don't create a defect for your friends because it puts them on the lunchroom TV screen. You go and put a post-it note on their monitor. So you actually start losing data. You actually start only thinking you're making an impact, and people start hiding the bad news. And if you do things like that, yes, I would sort of say probably no metric is better than that metric. But don't do that. Understand that the moment that you start measuring a metric, it has a half-life of about 3 months before that measure is probably useless alone. So you've always want to try and measure an ensemble of metrics, and you especially want to show that ensemble when they're competing for the same resources. Quality and productivity are always competing against each other. So you want to always show them together so that people can see that even if they do try and game one, the other one's going to catch up with them.
So when we talk about the gaming of a metric and even some of the misuse, what are some of the practices that you've seen and that you've incorporated into your coaching that have helped to alleviate some of those issues and to avoid some of those worst practices that we just talked about?
Well, number one is always you're interested in the trend over time, not the number. So most of the charts I use for coaching have no numbers on the axis, because the numbers are irrelevant. It's the trend of your team's progress on quality or productivity or predictability. So you can leave off the axis. It doesn't matter what the score is. And if the signs you have on the streets to show you your current speed in a car on the road, in the early days, they used to show how fast you were going. So it was always a race to see how high you could get the number. So even though you're in a 25 zone, I bet I can get that to 40. That was solved by just sort of stopping measuring at the speed limit. At 25, it just flashes. You can get the same impact without showing people the absolute number. You just want to let them understand where they are now versus where they were. And sometimes what's useful is to show where the rest of the company is against your team. So you can sort of see that you're actually above the company trend for quality, which helps explain why your productivity might appear lower than it would be if you were paying a higher price for injecting more defects or technical debt. So first thing is leave off the numbers. Second thing is always use a trend. Third thing is make it fair. Don't If you just took the throughput number, then of course larger teams will always appear to be doing better than smaller teams within the same company. So you want to start normalizing all of the measures to make them so that size doesn't matter.
When we're comparing metrics across teams and we do the normalization, what can help take into account complexity of work that the teams are working on? Because I can see a situation where, perhaps team A, they've been together forever, they're working on a well understood domain, and they're clearly going to, in most cases, do better than perhaps a team B that was newly formed, working in a more complex or chaotic domain that's not as well understood, and it will take them time to reach the cohesiveness and some of the other practices that team A, who's been together forever and with the understanding of the domain, have achieved. So when you're doing those kind of comparisons, is there a way to normalize for complexity of work and cohesiveness of team, or is that something that just has to be called out in some other way?
No, I mean, you tend to end up with 4 or 5 different groupings of types of teams. And you see that very early on. You'll see that so first of all, the team themselves, it doesn't really matter what the rest of the company is doing first and foremost. They worry just about the trends of the metrics within their team context. Great. When they then are working out what might be a candidate for them to try and improve for the next sprint or the next sort of couple of weeks, now you want to sort of see, well, what are we doing excessively good against the company average against? Now, initially what happens is you'll see there'll be, if you just plotted the line chart of these, every team with the same metrics normalized by size, there's sort of stripes, there's sort of groupings, and then you'll find that your operations teams will be one sort of grouping, and then you'll see that the teams doing risky new innovation will have another pattern, another sort of style of, out of the 4 quadrants, they'll be strong on one and weaker on others. So now what you want to do is you want to start separating those out onto their own dashboard so that you're comparing like versus like. People get concerned when they feel like they're being unfairly judged, and that's not your intention. Your intention is to sort of say teams in the same context and environment as you are know something you don't know yet, so why don't you go and ask them what they're doing in their practices, which are getting their quality so high. So it's about finding teams you can go and ask advice from.
So I think that's probably the first time I've heard a great reason to compare team versus team. That kind of practice, I think, gets a lot of attention from Agile coaches in a negative way because of that fairness qualification that you threw out, that people want to be treated fairly, they want to be compared fairly. But I think the idea of grouping teams among the type of work that they're doing, and I think, like you said, statistically or from a data perspective, that will tend to show itself out naturally, that they'll start banding together. But the idea that you're generating an insight to basically say, look, this team's found an interesting balance between productivity and quality that we value. This isn't your performance review. We're not putting this on your assessment. What we're saying is go talk to them and see how they're achieving that balance and see if there's a practice you can bring back to your team. I think that's an interesting reason to compare teams across companies. So that's...
Well, even if people are worried about being embarrassed. If you embarrass people, you've completely destroyed your metric program. So, the other thing is, mentioned before, how to make it sort of fair and how to avoid that embarrassing is there's no team names on my dashboard. So when you're actually looking at your line, depending on who's logged in or who's looking at the data, you only get to see which line is yours. Then you can sort of go and sort of investigate and find out, well, who's this other team which is doing much better than we are? So, of course, if someone wants to be malicious, they could be. But again, it's irrelevant. Don't go and put up on a dashboard, this is the team that's doing the best. That's not what it's intended to be. The way the metrics, especially if you measure across the 4 dimensions I mentioned, responsiveness, productivity, quality, and predictability, it is actually impossible for any team to be excellent at all 4. That cannot happen because all of the measures are actually they're anti-correlated. They work in opposite directions. So it's unlikely, even if you did in a dashboard that you're going to be worst across all four measures or best across all four measures. You might be best and worst at one or one out of the four, but you're not going to be best or worst at all four. So gaming and that embarrassment comes up if you focus on a single metric and people game that one metric. So it's harder to do when you've got to try and balance a set of four metrics.
Yeah, the four metrics that are, as you noted, that are in opposition. And so I think that's also an interesting twist to it, that you can't be excellent at all four. Like, you're not trying to get the high score in all four categories. It's really alignment with business values and business needs across the four, which I think is interesting. And then anonymizing it, taking the team names off. Essentially, you're removing the blame, the guilt, the embarrassment. I think it gives you the shot at having the 3-month half-life on the metrics that you mentioned.
That's right. And that's what you're trying to do. And to me, the most mature teams will be down the middle of all four. So if I do have a team that's high, that's a coaching intervention moment.
That's interesting. So I wonder if these metrics, do they go past the program level up into senior management, or do you typically keep these with the coaches, with the program leaders, so that they have the opportunity to make adjustments based on what they've been asked to deliver, but not necessarily exposing these dashboards or metrics higher up?
These dashboards in the form that are useful for the team and coaching don't go any higher than probably the managers or the program management team just above a group of teams who are trying to look at how much do I think that this team is going to be able to continue the pace they're moving at. And that's just so they get a bit of an understanding of risks. But yeah, once you put across more than a single metric, senior management get a bit bored. There's no dollar signs here. It's hard for them to rationalize what they're doing, what they mean.
Or heaven forbid they try to monetize it somehow, and then you're in for an even equally boring and probably worse discussion, right?
Yeah, that's right. But I mean, what we can do though is on the forecasting side is I can put a range on if a team is running in this variability of predictability versus this variability of predictability where A is 10 times worse than B. I can sort of put a dollar value on that about how much risk that's adding to the program, about how late they might be, but you don't know yet. So we can put dollar values on each of these measures. So that's often interesting, because that often is the gateway to actually introducing, well, this is why you do Agile and why we're first and foremost, we want a consistent pace.
So I think you've brought up an interesting pivot point for us, and that's the forecasting discussion. So I think another talk that you're going to be giving at Agile 2016 is forecasting using data, quickly answering how big, how long, and how likely. Really interesting topic as well. In the forecasting space, the conversations quickly go into the estimates versus forecasting. Are they the same thing? Are they different? For the context of your talk, where in that camp are you? Are estimates and forecasts equal? Are they separate kind of ideas, or what is your take on that?
I don't use story point estimates for forecasting. I find that they're not as good a predictor as what I can get through other measures, and the other measures I get are normally cheaper to obtain. So the rule of forecasting and statistics is when you have two measures that could be used to predict something in the future, you use the one that's cheapest to obtain. And story point estimates are one that's expensive to obtain, and they're a cheaper alternative. So I'll start off with that statement. So I'm more on the using data to forecast than estimating. But I'll now sort of go a little bit deeper on that to sort of say what happens is there's very different styles of teams based on the cycle times that they use for the tasks that they do. And if you're a team which doesn't have external dependencies, won't get blocked by other teams to deploy or get assets like images or screen layouts, and the person that gets the work can do the work, estimates would be a good predictor of the future. But if you're in a set of teams and you're doing work that has a lot of potential delays that are unknowable in advance, that depend on alignment of the stars, like 10 other prerequisites being delivered before you can do yours, your chance that the estimate would be a good predictor of time would be like flipping 10 heads of a coin in a row. So where most teams are somewhere between the two. So my default stance is that the teams are in the latter, and there's a lot of unknowable delays that affect time but not affect the actual hands-on effort of doing the work. And it's only if those two were in agreement that the hands-on time dictated the majority of the calendar time for delivery would estimates be worth doing. And that's a pretty well-known fact in other operationals research fields since the 1970s and 80s. So we don't have a lot of the estimates conversations outside of the software world. I think that there are some teams where estimates would be useful, but they're the teams that don't need to estimate. And the teams which we're using estimates for, especially story point estimates, the way we're doing them at the moment, there are cheaper alternatives for forecasting.
No, I think you've answered it well. But the problem with answering a question well is that it generates follow-ups.
Excellent.
And so some of these cheaper methods, can you go into that? What do you think is a cheaper method to forecast some of the project work that teams do?
Larry Mascheroni, he was the inventor of the software development performance index. The four measures I mentioned earlier come out of Larry Mascheroni's work when he was at Rally Development at the time. And I think Carnegie Mellon had a bit of a hand in some research he did where he got 10,000 projects worth of data and analyzed them to sort of see, is the folklore of Agile, can we see that proof that it's working in the data? And one of the observations which he did, the first thing you do when you get 10,000 projects is you start getting every measure that you can. And I think he ended up with about 100 different measures he could extract out of the data that they could get from those projects. And of course, the first one he wanted to look at was story point estimates versus sort of future sort of delivery forecasts. And he found that throughput and velocity gave very similar outcomes. Now, the advantage of throughput is that you don't have to have all the work estimated. You can just count the number of items. So throughput, if it gives the same forecasting predictive ability as velocity and story points, throughput is a better choice to use because it's cheaper to obtain. And I find that time and time again because of the way we do planning poker using sets of the Fibonacci sequence where there's sort of only 5 or 6 options to choose from, people tend to be centrally weighted. So I looked at 100 teams at another large organization, and the average is 3.5 across 100 teams. So each team's average is 3.5, and the whole group's average is 3.5. So it wasn't so much that story point estimates were accurate, it was that the average of story point estimates was 3.5, and that projects out. So throughput is, whether you use 1 or 3.5 in the formula, it doesn't really matter. So I tend to think that that's an example where throughput is a better way of forecasting than story points and velocity. Now, how do we get throughput and how do we get the number of stories that you want to complete over a period of time? Well, that's where we sort of start using a sampling technique where we don't break down every epic we have. We break down 10 or 11 of them, and we use the pattern of that 10 or 11 epics being broken down to extrapolate how many stories might be in the project.
So with a new team, it's a common question that people will ask. So they'll say, fine, we know that you have this team of 9 people. You know that they have a huge history together. They understand the domain, and typically they get 10 stories done in a sprint. That's a forecasting exercise that we can all do as long as we have a prioritized backlog and we can stack that 2-week sprint, 10 stories, and we can all figure out a calendar and do simple addition, and which is why these metrics why forecasting is so wonderful, right? It is a very simplified process. But with a new team, what are some of the things that you look at and some of the things that you do to help establish some kind of baseline for how work could potentially be completed, at least on a calendar?
At least on a calendar? That's great. So this is what I do. I have a set of spreadsheets which sort of help doing forecasting, and they're all free. So hopefully you'll be able to put a link up to them. But my base sort of work is sort of three levels. One is a simple spreadsheet throughput forecast. Now, since you don't have historical data, what we get you to do is estimate a range of data. So if you said 9 people there, I'd sort of say, well, let's go on the continuum that maybe everyone will get at least one story done per sprint. So you would tell the team, when you're choosing the size of work to split into a story, the goal is that at least you get at least one thing done for each sprint. And then some of those people will get maybe 2 things done. So what Monte Carlo forecasting allows you to do is be imprecise with your estimates, but still get a reliable answer. So we don't ask you to estimate the throughput as a number. We get you to estimate the throughput at a range. And with a brand new team, I might say between 1 item per team member to 1.5 items per team member. So my initial throughput estimate will be between 9 and 12 or 13. And what a Monte Carlo forecast does is that it plays out completing that project maybe 1,000 times. And for every step of the way, it randomly picks the throughput for that potential week, somewhere between 9 and 14. And then it does that over and over and over again until it completes the project. And then it does another project over and over and over again by taking random samples from that range of values you specified. So the way you do forecasting with new teams is we don't expect you to be precise with your estimates and we expect the estimates to be ranges, not absolute values. And that means that we don't get one answer of a result, we get a distribution of answers, and then we pick where we're comfortable in that distribution of saying we're going to deliver on or before. So if 1,000 simulated project runs finished within 6 weeks, we might sort of say, well, where did 80% of them finish? Well, 80% of them finished within 5 weeks. So we might say 5 weeks because now we say it's 80% likely that the project, given the knowledge we have now, will finish within 5 weeks. So it's about range estimates rather than the individual number.
I'm assuming once we have real data, do you repeat the Monte Carlo process, or at that point, are you simply forecasting off of the 2 or 3 sprints that you've completed and still establishing a range? So let's say like sprints 1, 2, and 3, they get 9, 5, and 10. Are we now only worried about those numbers, or are we plugging that into another simulation to see how the next 3 sprints or the rest of the project could potentially go?
Yeah, that's exactly right. You want to blend the data. The actuals as they come in start outweighing the estimate. When I get to about 30 maximum historical samples, I only go back previous actual history to maximum of 30 samples. So until I get those 30 samples, I start sort of blending the range estimate with the actuals. And I tend to put the actuals in the lowest of the range estimates to remove those out over time. And by running this continuously, what you end up getting is more and more certainty about how the team is performing. So don't go back too far, because it doesn't matter what your team was doing last year. It matters what it's doing in the last 6 or 12 weeks. And slowly sort of blend in the actuals with your estimates, because early on, there just hasn't been enough elapsed calendar time for you to see those poor samples yet come in. The high technical debt sprints where you get nothing done because you're just fixing defects. They haven't occurred yet. So you still want to leave space for understanding that the worst case scenario may not have happened yet, but you over time you end up moving to 100% team historical data.
So the blending concept, I think, it's interesting, because what we're working towards, I think, and Troy, your mastery of this space is far superior to mine, but I think if I've understood this right, we're working towards, it's just law of big numbers or law of averages. Initially, we're not going to have enough data to get there. And so as we blend in our actuals with the simulation, we're still able to get to the point to where the law of big numbers take over, and some of those predictions should normalize. Early on, it's tricky, but like you said, we get the 30 samples or so, real data takes over, And perhaps that's where we get a more, I guess, stable type of prediction. Am I close to that, or have I butchered it?
No, that's pretty much right. The biggest problem in our world, software, is that nothing we do in cycle time and task effort ends up being normally distributed. And especially the final delivery estimate we have, the normal bell curve that you would expect, where it's symmetrical around the average is in the center, is the same thing as the most common. That doesn't happen in the software world. We have a left skewed distribution with a very long right-hand tail. In other words, when things go wrong, they go way wrong. And that's a challenge for us. So that's why law of large numbers is hard to apply purely to our field of engineering, because we're more in the long tail risk world of the Nazem Taleb's, the Black Swans, author and so forth. There are a lot of things that can go wrong which cause a very large delay, and very few things we can do to accelerate the project massively. There are a lot more things that can go wrong than can go right to improve our performance. So what we're looking for when we're doing these forecasts using actual data is the realization that the things which went way wrong and take a long time to show up, we won't have samples for yet. So we need to make sure that we keep an eye on what's not finished yet and have an understand about, well, is that going to be 10 times longer than what the average is? And in most projects, in all projects, there will be something that'll be 10 times longer than the average. And that's what makes sort of forecasting software projects so exciting, is because we don't have a lot of data to work with to make these predictions. And there are these events like the production hardware didn't get installed in time, or there's one defect left and we can't ship until it's fixed, but we also can't put more people on it to make it faster. There are a lot of things which can elongate the delivery tail of one or two items, control and gate whether we can ship at all. And so, yes, you're right about the law of large numbers starts to apply with the general easy cases. But what we're trying to do when forecasting software is always remember that we live in a very risky field, and when things go wrong, they go wrong in a long date way.
So, do we take that risk into account, and then with our simulations, do we simply modify the range we're willing to accept, essentially building in margin, right?
And I tend to use two techniques for that. Yes, build in the margin. When you do Monte Carlo simulation, you're not so much at the mercy of an extreme estimate on any of those ranges. Your job when you do those range estimates is to make sure that the actual outcome lies somewhere between the range you say. So I tend to make people be very wide with their initial guesses on those ranges, because it tends to, just like you're unlikely to flip 10 heads in a row or 10 tails in a row, when you start sort of Monte Carlo forecasting and blending random numbers together, you're unlikely to get all the lowest value and all the highest value. You're much more likely to get a range of values in the center.
Right.
So I try and urge people to not be afraid to go down to maybe 0.25 to 3, because we're pretty certain that it's going to be within that range. But these risks I'm talking about, I tend to also forecast them in a slightly different way. So I tend to get people to give me 3 reasons why this project or feature won't ship on time, and give me the probabilities of those occurring. And if that does occur, how much work is involved in fixing it. And then what you end up having is there might be a 20% chance, say there was a 50% chance that a feature was going to hit a performance problem, and if you did that, there was going to be twice the amount of work as there originally was to retrofit an indexing server or something to improve performance. Well, now you would have 2 dates, and they'd be very distinct. There would be the date if you didn't have performance problems, and then there would be a date twice as large as that date, which was when the case of the risk come true that we needed to install an indexing server. So that's if you had one risk of 50%, you now have 2 modes on your forecast. You don't just have this nice, neat little sort of distribution curve. You have this 2 peaked, equal-sized dates, and they're both equally likely to occur. There's a 50% chance that might be in July. There's a 50% chance that might be in November. just based on that one risk coming true. So now you start to realize that all this time we spend estimating an individual story is absolutely pointless, when one risk coming true could double the amount of time we spend on the whole project. So I tend to spend a lot more time asking people to capture these things that could go wrong and how much work would be involved in fixing those than I do on the original estimates of the range of the throughput. And there's normally 3 or 4 major items where it's always the quiet lady or guy in the corner who knows something that you don't about what's going to block the project or feature being delivered that counts. So forecasting is more about understanding what's going to go wrong than what's going to go right. And it's that's what I find people don't even spend any time thinking about.
Yeah, it's clearly geared towards an agile project too, right? To uncover the scary bits of a project, prioritize them to the top so that we get through them. And I think in that way we also become more predictable by getting the hardest stuff out first and knowing or confronting some of those difficult pieces head on. So I think it's interesting that even through, both of the talks you're giving, it's all about generating insights.
Well,
and I like that part of it. What you're doing is you're doing simulations and metrics just to get insights, and then you can go and make decisions on those that are safe, transparent, and that lead to a better product.
And that's right. For this example, my coaching insight would be to the team. At the moment, you've got a 50-50 chance of hitting a very wide date range. What can we do to reduce the probability? What can you do as a team to get that 50% chance of a performance problem down to 25%? And some of them might say, well, let's do a spike and do some early performance runs. Great. So now you've got the teams understanding that there and knowing the impact of solving that high risk item first. So go away and find a way as a team to reduce my risk of a performance problem is a great challenge to set the team to do. And what you get on the management side is when they get that down to 25% chance of occurring or even 10% chance of occurring, what you've done to your forecast is now the early date in July is much more likely than the date in November. And that's sort of how you feed back the team's data and intelligence about what could go wrong back into a business risk. And you would deal on a business side, you probably wouldn't go and sort of book a conference keynote when you had a 50% chance that your product wasn't going to make it.
Right.
But if there was only a 10% chance that your product wasn't going to make it, and you could solve that by putting extra money into the team to maybe put a small indexing server in just in case, now you would book that keynote stage because you have a chance of getting there. What's more important is that the team has helped you with data to understand where that risk sits. And that's how I think you need to look at metrics and data and forecasting, is it's about getting a shared vision of risk and how likely things are to occur, not about sort of belting people up with a baseball bat because they're slow.
I think that's a great insight for us to close on today. I mean, clearly these 2 talks that you're giving at Agile 2016, very interesting stuff. The data-driven aspects of the Agile community it's not always highly promoted, but what I think you've done and what I really appreciate is I think you've made a great case for digging into the data, being aware of the value it can have on the coaching stances and coaching decisions that you make, and how ultimately you can significantly improve your program without embarrassing and hurting people, and just how valuable those insights are. So I really appreciate you bringing these ideas to the forefront, and I can't wait to see both of your talks in Atlanta in July.
Oh, listen, thank you. I can't wait to give them.
So at this point of the podcast, we ask the guests to plug anything they have going on. We've mentioned Agile 2016, but any other talks you're giving, books, resources, anything that you would like to get in front of the listeners that either relate to this conversation or to anything else that you have going on?
Great. Well, first and foremost is I, about the end of last year, started giving everything away I had for free. So I have a whole heap of resources up on GitHub which are spreadsheets to do staff risk capability analysis, all of the Monte Carlo forecasting. I have a set of spreadsheets which just from the start date and the end date give about 30 different charts based on that data. And these are all free. None of them use macros. They're all safe for the workplace. I just want people to start using them and giving me feedback about how they could be improved and where they fit. So I am definitely talking at the Agile conference. I have the 2 sessions there. I also have a book, Modeling and Forecasting Software Projects. That's sort of also available by PDF form. You can buy it on Amazon if you want the hard copy. You can download the PDF off my website as well. So I'd love, it's old and needs to be sort of updated, but it's got the basics in there. And the only other thing I have is I have a full programming language for modeling and simulating software projects. So often I find that once we even do a basic model visually step by step of how work flows through a system, we can start sort of doing what if analysis. Well, what if we did half the defect count? What sort of throughput improvement would we be likely to see? So I'd love people to start using that, and that's freely downloadable from the Focus Objective site as well. So they're the main things. I'm not traveling much this year, so I don't have a lot of other conferences on at the moment.
It's not always bad just spending time at home. So
that's right. I live in Seattle, so we get all of our rain during winter, and summer here is normally quite nice. So I'm going to stay home this year.
Well, very good. Well, hopefully we have an opportunity to say hello out in Atlanta in July and continue some of our conversations. And again, really looking forward to the talks you're giving, as this is an area that it's one that I haven't always been open to. I need to think about these ideas a little more carefully. So really appreciate you providing this introduction to some of these ideas. And if you're going to be at Agile 2016, highly recommend these talks, as they do give they seem, especially from the descriptions in this discussion today with Troy, a practical approach to looking at not only data, but simulation and how that can actually influence and coach back up through your team. So I think it's a very important topics that help bring professionalism and I think discipline to our profession. So Troy, really appreciate that.
Thank you, Rod.
And I'm your host, Ryan Ripley. This week, not too many plugs. I'll be speaking at Path to Agility coming up here in late May. We'll be out at the Agile conference in Atlanta. May have a few other speaking engagements coming up, but like Troy, trying to spend some time at home with a newborn baby and my other 2 children, and just trying to stay grounded in family for a while. So that's what I've got going on. Just wanted to thank all the listeners. Just incredible amounts of feedback coming in through Twitter, through email, through comments on the website. You guys are all great. You've pushed this podcast into a new stratosphere of success, especially among the rankings in iTunes and all of those other measurements and metrics and data that Troy would love to look at. But I think those fall in the vanity metrics category, not so much the valuable category, but sometimes that happens.
And it's allowed to.
Definitely. But all of you have been great. Really appreciate the feedback and comments. And the podcast cannot be successful without all of you. So thank you for listening. Thank you for being there. And can't wait for you guys to tune in next time. With that said, Troy, thank you again for being here. Really enjoyed it. And I hope all of you have a great day.
Thanks for listening to Agile for Humans. Let's keep the conversation going. Drop us a question on Twitter @AgileForHumans or visit agileforhumans.com.